Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our webinar participants from around the globe. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to part one of our Job Search Bootcamp, a three-part series dedicated to helping you land your dream job in global development. From CVs to cover letters and other tips for job search success, we have it covered in our webinar series exclusive for DevX Career Account members. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kate Warren, Senior Director and Editor here at DevX, and today I'm going to be revealing the secrets to a standout CV. But before we get started, I'd like to do a quick sound check to make sure everyone can hear me. If you can, could you please type yes into the chat box? Great. Thank you, everyone, for responding. So as you know, global development is a very competitive job market, and it also has different rules and norms when it comes to CVs. However, having worked with numerous global development employers, organizations, donor agencies, consulting firms, you name it, over the years, I get an inside look at what employers are looking for and how you can stand out as an applicant. So my hope is to share with you some of those insights today. Your CV is the single most critical item to your job search. However, hundreds of applications sometimes land on the desk of a recruiter or hiring manager, and so they often only have just a few seconds to review each CV. So that's why it's really essential to your job search success that your CV really stands out and highlights your most relevant experiences, qualifications, and skills in a way which is quick and easy for the employer to understand. So during today's webinar, I'll be talking you through the steps to creating a recruiter-ready CV that will help you get noticed. And after my presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so you can enter questions using the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner of the Ready Talk window. So feel free to submit questions at any time during the webinar, and we'll be keeping track of them, and I'll try to get to as many as time allows at the end. If you have any technical problems during the webinar, you can send a message through the chat box to tech support, and one of my colleagues will be able to assist you. Great. Well, I am going to go ahead and get started, and I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to be thinking about your CV, particularly working in global development. So I mentioned global development is a very competitive sector. So for some roles, when we speak to recruiters or when we're helping to recruit on behalf of an organization, there might be hundreds, even thousands of applications that come in. So a recruiter who's searching through those has a big task of them of trying to find those top candidates quickly. So you want to make sure that you are one of those few that gets into the yes pile. There's also specific norms and expectations for CVs and global development that might differ from other sectors. So particularly if you're transitioning from another industry or maybe you're a recent graduate, standard CV advice might not always apply in a global development context, so it's important to be aware of some of those differences. The other reason your CV is so important is as an aid worker, you can often always be on the move. So a lot of people work as an independent consultant or do a lot of shorter-term projects. So they're kind of always on the hunt for that next job. And you never know when an opportunity will pop up and you'll have to have your CV ready at a moment's notice. So it's really, I think, important for aid workers, particularly those that are anticipating moving around a lot through their career, to always have a polished CV ready to make sure that you don't miss out on any new opportunities that come up. So you notice I'm using the term CV, and there's CV and resume. I may use them interchangeably throughout our discussion, and part of that is really the terms are used somewhat interchangeably within our sector. Curriculum vitae CV is the more internationally recognized term. It's a term you more commonly hear used in global development. It's usually a more comprehensive document that has more detail than a resume. A resume would just be like a 1 to 2 page summary of your professional experience. A resume is sometimes more popular or commonly used within the United States for other private sector positions. But I think when we talk about a CV or resume in development, some employers and hiring managers really use the term somewhat interchangeably. They have similar characteristics. The CV is generally longer, includes some more details, get into very specific details around your achievements, skills, training, certifications, publications. And the CV tends to be a little bit longer. It can be 3 to 5 pages. I usually recommend trying to make sure it does not get past that 5-page mark, even 3-page mark. So anything beyond that, you're probably going to lose the reader's attention beyond those first few pages. So really trying to keep it tight while comprehensive is one of the challenges we'll be talking through today about how to approach. So I always recommend, as far as getting your CV house in order, is to have your basic CV. And this is what you will use to work off of and tailor as you're applying to specific positions. But it's great to have this kind of standard CV that you can upload to your DevX profile, that if you are reaching out to your network and trying to help get referrals, or you are looking to do an informational interview, you can use this kind of standard CV resume. But I do definitely encourage you, if you're applying to a specific job opportunity, that you tailor that and update the CV to speak to the specific requirements of that job and of that employer. Some things you'll see here, just some standard. This is a template that we like to use. There's no one set template, although some employers do require. For example, if you are working with an organization that gets funds from the EU, they might have the Europass resume template they prefer. Sometimes when you're applying to UN jobs, they have this T11 form, although a lot of them are getting away from using that. There's no one set template, but this is one that we like. I will post here in the Q&A section here a link to an article we have on DevX that has some downloadable CV templates, and as a career account member, you have access to those. So if you're not quite sure how to format your CV, this can be a good start, but of course there's no one set way of doing it. This is just one that we've worked on in consultation with many recruiters. So having some of your basic information up front is obviously important, your contact information, email. And what we usually recommend is having a headline that really will brand your skills and experience, followed by key qualifications, and then your professional work experience in reverse chronological order, starting with your most recent and working backwards. So to talk a little bit about that headline, and here I'll go back here again real quick, and so you'll see this is what is right under your name. This is what really can help brand you and your expertise. It's one of the first things a recruiter will see, so it can really help solidify who you are as a professional and really grab their interest to want to read more. So some examples of what a headline could be: senior private sector development and project management professional, governance, rule of law, and anti-corruption expert. So if you do have a technical expertise, really describing that area, and your headline is important. If you have more of a, say you're a monitoring and evaluation or project management expert, using those terms. Now your headline can also be, can evolve depending on the job that you're applying to. So maybe you do have both strong project management and technical expertise. If you're applying to a job that's more of in the technical area, you might want to use a headline that highlights that technical expertise. If you're applying to a job that's more of a general program management, you might want to choose a headline that showcases your experience in that area. So it's not your default title. It is really how you want to best capture your key skills and expertise, again, branding yourself as that professional. Some questions that you could ask yourself and helping to guide on your key qualifications. So here, again, I'm going to flip back here to the example, and under the headline, you'll see the key qualifications section. Here we have it bullet pointed with some sentences and bolded areas. This is where you can really bring up to the front of the top part of your CV, your most relevant experience. What I love about having this kind of section in your CV is say some of your really impressive work experience was a few jobs back. This allows you to bring that right up front. And when you're thinking about, in newspaper speak, they say top of the fold is the most important real estate. That first half of the first page of your CV is your most important real estate. That's where a recruiter or hiring manager will spend the most time looking. If they like what they see, then they'll keep continuing through the CV. But if they don't, they'll probably put you in the no pile and move on. Because remember, they often have hundreds of CVs they're trying to get through. I think some of the stats, and they've done studies on this, say that the average amount of time a recruiter spends looking at a CV is about 6 seconds. Much of that is on that first half of the first page. So the key qualifications section allows you to really showcase your most relevant, impressive experience. So again, if you are having your base CV, you want to think about what are the kinds of positions that I'm interested in and what would be the most relevant, impressive experience for me to highlight. But if you are applying to a specific job, I really recommend spending a lot of time editing this section to really speak to the requirements of that position. If there are language requirements and you speak that language, definitely put that there. If there's a specific degree requirement that you meet, definitely put that there. If you've worked in that same region or country, even if it was 5-10 years ago, this would be the place to highlight that so they see that right away. Some other questions that can guide you would be, what do you want to be professionally known for? What is unique about you that might help you stand apart from other applicants? What can an employer expect you to bring to the table? And this is where you can even describe more at a macro level your expertise. Sometimes a challenge with the CV is because it tends to be itemized by your work experience. It's harder to tell that narrative of the collective experience you've gained over the course of your career, but your key qualifications area is a good place to do that. And then really think about what is most important to this position, to this employer that I want to make sure that they see right away. This is what you want to focus on in that key qualifications section. Another really important thing to consider are keywords. So as I'm sure you've all had experience, when you're applying to a job online, typically it is online. You're submitting your CV through sometimes what's called an applicant tracking system, an online recruitment system. Maybe you're applying through DevX, but you are submitting electronically your CV. What happens on the back end is many employers do use an electronic system to receive and go through their CVs. Now, some of these systems even have technology built in that will review your CV, look at the keywords, measure it against the keywords that were in the job description, even rank the applicants based on how many matches they are. This is a way to try to help the recruiters find the best applicants in the batch. And so it's really important to think about making sure that you use keywords to your advantage so that you can make sure that your CV will be sifted to the top of that list. Even if an employer is not using that kind of technology, and I would say that most employers I know still definitely look through all applications. They don't completely rely or trust on the technology to have an accurate assessment. They're more likely to spend more time looking at the people who their platform suggests are better matches. But even if not, that's really what the human eye is doing. So a recruiter, again, 6 seconds to look through your CV. They're doing a quick scan for keywords. Oftentimes, too, the person who's doing the front line review might be a fairly junior level recruiter. They likely do not have a deep level of expertise in whatever your specific area is. So they're going to be looking for very obvious keywords that will show that you have the experience that is necessary, so that if they pass your CV on to the hiring manager would say, why did you give me this person's CV? So they're not going to be able to read between the lines, have a more nuanced look at your experience. So you want to make sure you're being very explicit in how you match the requirements to them. So looking at the job description, the keywords that they used is a really good clue into what keywords a recruiter or that system will be looking for. So make sure you use some of those same keywords and really, again, customize it to each job that you're applying to. When you are creating a CV to put to your DevX profile or more your general CV, then look at the kinds of jobs that you're interested in applying to and some of the common keywords that you see there. If you are transitioning from another sector, sometimes there's different terms that are used within development to basically communicate the same thing. So you want to make sure that you're using the same terminology just so that it will resonate with the person reviewing your CV. You also want to think about common acronyms. Now you want to be a little bit careful about acronyms too, so if they're not very commonly used or known, but there are some very common ones. For example, if you work with the United States Agency for International Development, USAID contractor, many of those employers are looking for people who have previous USAID experience, so they might be using that as a keyword when searching for people who match. M&E for monitoring and evaluation is another common acronym. It can be good, particularly as you're thinking about gaming the keyword system, to use both the written out term in one instance and then also the acronym. So depending on how people are searching for that keyword, they want to make sure that you show up. So, in addition to applying to jobs online, you may have your CV uploaded to DevX or other online databases. On DevX, we have thousands of recruiters that use our database to search proactively for candidates for their positions. And in fact, we have an in-house team of recruiters that do searches on behalf of many of our clients as well. And so we're using these kind of keywords, and the recruiters are using these keywords to find people that match. So you want to make sure that you are using them so that in addition to applying to jobs, you might actually get approached for a job that a recruiter thinks you'd be a good match for. So again, this was slight warning on acronyms is that you don't want to just assume that people will know what those acronyms are, particularly if they're very specific to your niche area. So an example here, led FLR program during planning and implementation stages. Lots of acronyms here that might not be familiar to the recruiter. Again, because sometimes recruiters are pretty junior level, they're very specific to your technical area of expertise, and maybe the hiring manager would understand. If the person who's first reviewing your CV doesn't, it might not make it to that stage, so you just want to be mindful of that. So here's an example of being able to write out the acronym, can put it in brackets, and then you can use the acronym after that. Using both is great because, again, some people might use the acronym when searching for experience and some might use the full term. So using both is a good strategy. So I'll talk a little bit about your professional experience and how to communicate that. Again, reverse chronological order, so writing your current or most recent job and working backwards is by far the preferred method. Now, there are sometimes some cases where putting together what they might call a functional resume, where you more group your experience by areas of expertise and functions and don't focus so much on the dates, particularly for people who have large gaps. Sometimes that can be a good strategy, but really at the end of the day, recruiters get turned off by that and feel like you have something to hide and really want to be able to see what is the order of your career path, your trajectory. So including somewhere in your CV, your work experience reversed chronologically is really important to not frustrate the person reviewing it. A few things to make sure you include in your professional experience. If you are working, say, on a project that is funded by a donor, say it's a DFID or USAID funded project, make sure you include the name of, say, the implementing organization that you may be working for that has hired you. Maybe that's an NGO or a consulting firm, as well as the fact of who the donor is, because that's really important to a lot of recruiters. It's not only the organization you work for, but who funded that project. So USAID, DFID, maybe there's a Gates Foundation. Make sure you include the funder. Make sure you include the project name too, and including the acronym. A lot of projects have these kind of cute acronyms. If it's a pretty well-known project, that might be familiar to some people, but again, because not everyone might be familiar with the acronym, spelling out the project name and including the acronym can be important details. Another important detail to include if you are, this is for more project-based experience, is the overall budget, particularly if you are in a management capacity. That's a detail that people really like to know is how big was the project? Was it a $1 million project, a $50 million project? It gives them an idea of your experience on working on different sizes of programs. And of course, the location. If you were doing, say, a home office job, backstopping a project in another country, put where you were based, and then make sure you include in your experience the countries that it supported, and particularly if you spent any time there or traveled out to that country. That can help you get over a little bit sometimes that hurdle of not having international experience, or maybe you have done international experience in a short-term or support basis. Talking about your professional accomplishments, I know this is an area that a lot of people struggle with, is how to really describe the work that they've done in a way that will impress a recruiter and hiring manager. So here's an example of kind of maybe what not to do. So here's responsible for day-to-day operations of a regional sub-office, answerable for the work done by staff and the overall success of the sub-office program. I mean, that can tell me what you would do on a day-to-day basis, but it doesn't tell me anything about what you've accomplished, what value you've added to this role. So an example would be, led a team of 5 direct reports, including 2 project managers, 1 M&E specialist, 1 communications officer, and 1 security officer in a previously underperforming regional sub-office. After 6 months, our office is recognized as having achieved the fastest growth rate of all 12 sub-offices. So this is really showing me the value that you added, your contribution, and the result. And a really good simple formula for thinking through how to write that is called CAR. So that stands for context plus action plus result. So thinking about what was the context of the situation, what did you do, and then what was the result? How did you add value to it? So in this case, the context would be it was a previously underperforming regional sub-office. Action was through your leadership of this team. The result is achieving the fastest growth rate in all 12 sub-offices. So this is, again, a very simple formula as you think about describing your experience. It's also, I think, a good way to think about talking about your experience as you prepare maybe for an interview. So it's a really good way of just framing how you've added value in your professional work experience, both when you're writing it down or when you're talking about it to somebody. So I want to take a minute to talk about some common dilemmas that we see people facing in the global development sector. One is, a work history just has a lot of short-term projects and consultancies, and that can very quickly turn into a very long CV. I have definitely seen 20, 30-page plus CVs, which while I understand you want to be able to fit all that experience in there, it can be quite overwhelming to a recruiter to receive a document so large. Another common dilemma is having large gaps in employment. And then another very big issue we see is people are looking to transition to global development, maybe from another sector, and it can be really hard to communicate and translate your skills and show how you would be able to fit into a global development organization, particularly without having to start again from the entry level. So I will talk a little bit about how to approach some of these. So when you have too many short-term projects and consultancies in your work history, one way to think about getting over this is creating a kind of highlights reel. So rather than including every little project that you've worked on, you're going to have under your professional experience, select assignments include or highlighted assignments include. and include the ones that are most relevant to that position that you are applying to. Or again, if it's not a CV you're preparing for a specific position, picking a wide range of the positions that you think show the depth and breadth of what you can do, or tailoring it to the kinds of positions you hope to get more of. Saying select assignments or highlight assignments can also show that this isn't the full history, but you just want to show what's most important to this recruiter, this employer. Some people group this under like having an independent consultancy or small business name, and then include the dates for how long they've been doing that. This can actually also be a good way to smooth over any gaps in employment, particularly people who are working on as a consultant or on a lot of projects. It's very natural to have gaps in your resume just because, you know, it's very hard to have perfectly linear career and align assignments back to back. By grouping them all under a independent consultant, or even if you have a small business name, it can help show that consistency of working even though there might be some gaps in between specific projects. I encourage you to have a full list of all of your assignments somewhere that you can draw upon. It can be kind of your data bank to pull into a CV. And then if an employer does want to see the full list, you have that available. But then being able to customize that to specific opportunities can help avoid having a 30-page resume that, you know, people aren't going to really be able to get through. Another challenge is a large gap in employment. I would say that, again, they are more common in the development sector just given the project-based nature of the work. So, a 2 to 3 month gap is not going to raise big flags for most recruiters. They understand that's kind of the nature of the work, particularly if you're doing more field-based, project-based assignments. But if you have a 6-month, 1 year plus gap, sometimes that can raise red flags. And then particularly longer gaps than that, and the longer you've been out of the workplace, the harder it can be. But including any volunteer or consulting work you've done in between employment is really important. Even if it's not directly related to your career, there's always a way to show how it is transferable. So maybe you've taken off a few years for raising young children. If you've done some volunteer work or consulting work, you can, again, use that independent consultant title and then get some examples of that volunteer work to help smooth over that gap. I often get asked around, should you even put in your CV that you were raising children or taking care of an elderly family member, whatever that reason may be. I don't have a real strong answer because it really depends on the recruiter. I've seen some recruiters be turned off by that. I've seen more and more openness and appreciation for the fact that this is a reality for many people's lives and not holding it against them. But I think whenever preferable, if you do have some work that you've been doing through gaps, being able to really focus on that is important. And then again, really relying on that key qualifications section that's up front to draw your past experience that is most relevant, that maybe was 5-10 years ago, but allows you to have that kind of up in front at the top of your resume. So a lot of people are looking to transition to the global development sector, and there's quite an openness and willingness and even demand for people who have experience in maybe the private sector or high tech, all different kinds of industries, that their skills and experience can be very valuable in development, and we're seeing more and more crossover between development and other industries and vice versa, and more movement back and forth. But it still can be really challenging, particularly if you're coming from a sector that maybe has that one-page resume rule, which doesn't really exist in development. They like more 2 to 3 pages, like to see more experience fleshed out, and maybe just use a very different terminology. So you want to really be thoughtful about how you're describing your experience. Again, focusing on your transferable skills, So the aspects of your job that are most relevant to the kinds of jobs that you're looking at in development. And when you're choosing the jobs that you think you would be a good fit for, really focusing on those that have a lot of those common transferable skills and experiences. Sometimes I see people that are trying to make too big of a jump, and it can be really challenging if you have no experience in that area. So a good way of getting your foot in the door is to find those jobs that will align with some of your past experiences, but give you some new skills that maybe in one or two more job moves you'll get to where that ultimate dream job is. So when you're looking at the jobs, thinking a lot about where would I have the best chance of adding value and demonstrating my value early on, and then once I get in the door, how can I leverage that experience to get to the jobs that I really ultimately want to do. But you really want to think about, again, those keywords and aligning them with those be more global development. So if you're coming from a business background and you're really focused on revenue and profit and loss and the bottom line, those are not terms that are going to resonate so much with a development audience. So you want to be thinking more about your impact, maybe some like fundraising that you've done, business development and program development. You also want to really avoid very industry-specific jargon to your sector. Again, those acronyms and other terms that just will not resonate with the development audience. And then also be sure to play up any volunteer, consulting, pro bono work that you've done that might help demonstrate your real passion and interest for working on global development issues, even if your past work experience hasn't been explicitly in development. But if you can show you have the basic skills and then you also have the motivation and exposure to this sector through outside volunteer work, that can really help demonstrate how you could add value to an organization. So a few more just common sense CV tips. Obviously, apply consistent use of verb tenses. So some of these are very basic. Another one that sometimes people don't think about is giving it a very simple, clean file name. So I've seen a lot of CVs with the file name that is very long, and it'll be like version 8 with all these initials, edits, and it just looks sloppy. So if you're touting attention to detail as one of your skills, this is a good way to show that and communicate that you do have that attention to detail. So it just makes it look more polished and presentable. It's also really helpful to a recruiter if the file name has your name in it. Makes it easier for them to save it and send it around and not have to rename it. There's just a little thing you can do that can get you in good graces of the recruiter. Obviously, review and review. So don't let those little mistakes make you look bad. If there's a job that you're really, really gunning for, having a friend review your CV, it's so much harder to catch your own mistakes than it is for someone else. So asking a friend to do that is always, I think, great. And also thinking about a professional sounding email address, particularly for people who maybe are more recent graduates, but having an email address that maybe focuses around a hobby or a nickname won't sound quite as professional as having one that just has your name in it. Obviously, not everyone's name is available, so you might have to add some other unique identifier in there, but trying to keep it pretty simple and professional is another little small clue to the employer. Definitely do not use the email address of your current employer. That can be a big turnoff. It makes the employer think that if you're using your current employment email address or working on their time, you might do the same when you join them. So, make sure it's easy to set up a Gmail account or some other email if you need to. So that brings me to Q&A. I see that there are a lot of questions that come in. I frankly could talk about CVs for hours, so this was a bit of an abbreviated version of trying to get to some of the real basics. But I will get to some of your questions here, and feel free to keep submitting them. We'll keep flagging them. So first one I see is, in your headline, is it appropriate to put what you're passionate about if it's relevant to the position or company, or should you save that for the cover letter? For example, I'm passionate about projects creating inclusive economic growth through supply chains. Yes, I think that is absolutely a great way to showcase that passion for many global development employers. Finding employees that are mission-driven and have values that align with them is really important. So they want to hire people who are truly motivated to do the work that they do and are passionate about it. So being able to communicate that from your CV to your cover letter is definitely important, but you don't want to overly rely on your passion. You need to show that you also have the skills and the experience, and that it's not just your passion that's driving you, that yes, you have the passion, but you align it with the skills and experience. You sometimes see people rely too much on their passion, and a lot of jobs are, frankly, desk jobs where you're in meetings all day and you're sitting at a computer, and they just want to make sure that your expectations are aligned with what the work is. So if they get a sense that you have a too romanticized view of what the work entails, it sometimes can be a red flag, but absolutely communicating your passion is important. And your question actually reminds me of another point I wanted to make around cover letters. Often people think of a cover letter as their introductory statement, and that's something that maybe the recruiter will read first. Cover letter, the name of it, communicates that would be like the first thing they would read. But actually in all of our surveys with recruiters and experience working with them, they look at the CV first. If they like what they see, then they may look at the cover letter. Some recruiters, cover letters are very, very important to them, and some hiring managers, they really, really value them. Some it's really not so much. They just really care about what are your quantifiable skills, does it match the experience, and they're basically looking at your CV to check those boxes. But the problem is when you're applying to a job, you don't necessarily know who's going to be reviewing it and whether or not those cover letters are important. So I always encourage you to spend the time to craft a well-written, customized cover letter, but also know that don't rely on them reading the cover letter to get really critical information in evaluating you for the job, because they will be looking at that CV first and then deciding if they want to look at the cover letter. So anything that you think is critical that they know about you, you want to make sure is in the CV. So we have a question about what about when accomplishments are not quantifiable? That is a great question, and that, again, is a challenge of presenting your skills in a CV, which is a document that really lends to quantifiable experience. And when we talk to recruiters and employers and we ask them about what's most important in their hires, is it the soft skills or those hard technical skills? Always they say it's those soft skills, those people skills. And yes, you can list them on your CV, but everyone can. So how do you really demonstrate that? I think if you can combine a little bit of maybe some of your softer work with a quantifiable result, but being able to weave it into the narrative of how maybe your collaboration skills was able to build consensus amongst very divergent stakeholders to result in X. Being able to weave in some of those softer skills into your narrative, it's a tricky thing to do, but it can be really powerful in showing how your softer skills really lend value and help you achieve results from the job. Again, a cover letter is sometimes a little bit easier section to do this. Also, in that key qualifications section up front, you can have it be bullet pointed and a little more quantifiable, but you can also do it more in a paragraph and narrative form where you can describe more who you are as a professional and bring in some of that softer side of your work and some of those other skills that are a little harder to quantify, including some examples. So you don't have to be just looking at bullet points of what you've done for that section. So I see another question here. What if you are doing a pro bono consulting assignment either for increasing one's experience or for a startup where there is ideally an upside of the business take off? So I love how you are calling this a pro bono consulting assignment. And I do encourage people, if you are doing even if it's unpaid volunteer work, but you're actually using your skills and expertise and providing a real value in what you're offering, that it's absolutely, I think, accurate to describe it as pro bono. And by calling it that, I think it's showing, assigning value to it. Sometimes people value volunteer experience less, but by calling it and framing it pro bono work, it's showing that there is real value. I think that is a great way of breaking into the sector, particularly if you're doing a job transition, and then being able to show how you've added value to that business is absolutely a great thing to do and a great way to frame that experience. We recently did a webinar with the CEO from Moving Worlds, which is a group that helps align skills-based volunteers with organizations, and he very much echoed that talking about that experience in a pro bono consulting terms is absolutely accurate and a good way of really being able to demonstrate to employer down the line how you've done similar work, even if it wasn't in a paid capacity. Question around, is leaving the workforce to pursue another degree considered a gap, or would it raise a red flag? No, definitely not. So having time off to pursue another degree wouldn't raise red flags. Now, sometimes when I'm talking to people who are considering going back to school and maybe they're mid-career professionals, I do encourage them, if it is at all possible, to remain employed even part-time while they're in school. It can really help with finding a job on the other side. If you've continued to be gaining work experience, you still have that work network to rely on. But if you've taken off a couple of years to go back to school, that's absolutely fine. You also want to make sure that you are, beyond just including the space for your degree, any other, say, practicum or intern type work that you've done during that degree program would really be important to showcase. So another question on any guidelines for when you have more years of education than years of experience. For example, a doctorate, a couple of master's degrees versus 2.5 years of field experience. This is another great question, and I think sometimes people, when they are in this situation, find that they are overqualified for many positions while being underqualified for others. I do see that if you have a doctorate and not a lot of experience, it can scare off employers if you're applying for a more entry mid-level position. The reasons being is they may think that A, you're going to want too much money for the job, or B, you might not be satisfied with the level of the work if it's something that maybe is more administrative in nature. So those are things to be aware of, and as you talk about your interest in the job and your experiences, making sure that you aren't communicating that you are looking for a job to do something that is well beyond what the actual scope of the position is that you're applying to. Also thinking about where you place your education experience in your CV. So I would put that more after your work experience if you're afraid that it might scare people off too much. In your key qualifications, you could just focus on the degree that is most relevant to the job you're applying to, but then also have the other degrees more towards the end of your CV and really focus more on your work experience. But everyone, whether or not you have a PhD or multiple master's degrees or not, and when you're in that 2 to 3 year experience range, it can be a tricky place to be because there aren't as many positions that are, say, for 3 to 5 years of work experience as there are for those that are maybe 10 plus. So it's hard for everyone, no matter what your education is. And in fact, you should see any kind of experience that you gain through those different degree programs that are a little bit more on the practical side, really playing that up in your key qualifications to help you get over that. Somebody asked about language skills. Is it important to include number of years of professional experience for each language? I would actually recommend more communicating your fluency level. So employers are going to care most about a language that you can work in, that you have a working, that you would be able to conduct business in. It's great if you've taken some basic Spanish or French and to demonstrate your interest in other languages. But I typically like to see when the language is maybe a scale of, is it basic, intermediate, fluent, or native, or working proficiency, if you have enough that you can work in it, and then really highlighting languages that you actually would be able to do your job in that language. The number of years of experience probably is not as relevant as knowing that can you actually work in that language. But if you have experience doing work in a language that is foreign to you, it is good. It can be good to quantify that, but you want to make sure that you're also clarifying your fluency level. Some people use different scales that maybe the UN system or different government systems use. The challenge with that is that they aren't uniform, and it might not mean the same to one person as another. So I prefer a more simplified, that fluent, native, working proficiency type system that can really be understood by everyone. So here's another question. I am a 50-year-old professional. That means I've gone through a lot of changes, sometimes vacancies, announcements look for people who only work in one field. How do older people like me adapt their CV? That is a fantastic question, and one that I think many people, even at all stages of their career, face, where maybe they don't have one deep area of expertise, but they've had a lot of multiple experiences. I actually think that's a positive thing, and the more that we talk to employers and recruiters, that's increasingly what they are looking for in professionals, or people who have a diversity of experiences, that are very flexible and nimble, able to see problems from many sides, have worked on problems from many different angles, different types of stakeholders, and that is very much becoming almost a skill set in itself. So one way is to really focus on that being a real value that you add, that you have more, maybe that generalist type of experience or across many different areas. But there's no jobs now that are, there are some that are really focused on one technical area, but to really succeed in a job, being able to branch out and see how your work is impacted by other sectors or vice versa, working within and across silos, that is very much how organizations are trying to orient their work. So being able to play up that diversity of your experience can actually be a net positive. There are going to be those positions that are still very technically focused, but we're seeing more and more, and as we talk to even HR professionals from UN agencies to NGOs, they are seeing less of that and more of a, sure, if you have technical expertise, they will want to see how you can operate in a variety of different environments, because the nature of our work is that it changes very quickly. Another question here. Can we consider skills acquired in the course of university studies as transferable skills? Yeah, that's a good question, and sometimes I think employers don't value, say your coursework in a degree program. They wouldn't value that the same as actual work experience. If your university studies gave you some very hands-on experience as part of that, I know some programs will match students up with an actual organization to help them solve a problem. That can be a really great way of showing how you actually have those tangible skills. If you've done any kind of internship or case study, if you can find any other way of showing and demonstrating how you've used those skills in a real-world scenario, not just learned in the classroom, that is definitely preferable. But absent that, being able to demonstrate and talk about them in the course of your studies is definitely better than not having it. But a challenge will be for you is trying to demonstrate and get some experiences to show how you've actually taken those skills you learned in school and applied them on the job. Another question on volunteer work. If we list our volunteer work as actual professional experience, would you feel misled as a recruiter if you were to call an organization for a reference and discover that the candidate was in fact just volunteering and is not a paid position? Great question. I think that, again, if you talk about it in pro bono consulting, that wouldn't be misleading as far as saying it was a full-time job when really it was volunteer. I would not be turned off by that if I was doing a reference check. So you might want to consider using that term of a pro bono consultant. And it still, again, communicates that it was more of a kind of professional capacity, that you weren't doing a volunteer job that just anyone could do, that you actually had real skills that you were delivering to the organization that they needed. And personally, as a recruiter, I would find that experience almost just as valuable as a paid position. Another question, should we remove the experience that is not relevant to the position we are applying? That is an excellent question. I love that question. Something that I absolutely do recommend is curating your CV, again, because you only have so much time to communicate that you are a right fit for that position. The more extraneous information that you add, it really just dilutes the impact of what is really relevant. So when people often ask me, like, how long should I have my CV, I recommend not having page length be your guide, but however much space it takes to succinctly communicate your relevant experience. So really honing in on that. As a recruiter, if you're seeing like all of their experience is so relevant to what I'm doing, you're not having to look through it and pick apart against others. It makes it a lot clearer to see why you would fit. So absolutely, again, that means removing experience. Sometimes that can be painful because it's it's something you're proud of or you really like doing, but if it's not going to really add value to that specific job, I do think it's better to remove that. And if there ever is a little bit of a question, really having relevant experience be your guide, it's kind of hard to go wrong there. Here's a question on, do you recommend having a CV graphically designed so that it stands out and is more reader-friendly? Another great question. I think a lot of sectors are doing a lot more fun things with their CVs and more graphics, particularly because everything's online and digital and looking to be more creative. Development tends to be a little old school, but it really depends on the employer. So I would say if you are working in an area that maybe is in the design or creative field, maybe communications, that can be a good idea, is to have a more design-friendly CV template. And I've seen some really great ones that really lay out your experience in a very compelling, engaging way without being too distracting. Too many colors, logos, stuff like that can get a little distracting. One thing to be careful of is sometimes online application tracking systems, they review your CV and they parse information into the system. And if you have a uniquely formatted CV, it can sometimes not get parsed correctly. Now, that really is more of a problem on the recruiter side. They're probably still going to look at your CV, but just something to be mindful of, particularly if you're applying to, say, like a UN or World Bank job. And then some of those more traditional employers, the hiring managers that might be reviewing your CV, some of them can be turned off by a CV that is a little too graphic-y designed and they really want a more traditional format. So think about the employer that you're applying to and whether or not you think that would help demonstrate that you would fit into their corporate culture. So if it is a place that's pretty traditional, then that might not be the best approach. But if it is a newer firm or group that's getting more involved in the tech innovation space, it can be a good way to set yourself apart. Let's see, a question here is, what if you have a lot of experience, 15 years plus, but no master's degree? How do you overcome this, especially with online systems? So that's a great question, kind of the flip side of another audience member who has little experience and a lot of education. The sector is become where having a master's degree is almost a requirement. But the funny thing is when you talk to employers and recruiters and you ask them what really is more experience, education or experience, they say experience. Hands down, it's experience. The high education requirements, I think, is just the nature of how competitive the field is, and it's frankly an easy way to cut down on applications if you put that education requirement. Now, there are definitely positions that do require a high level of skills and expertise, and degrees can help you get there, but a lot of people are able to get that through work experience, and so having that lack of a master's can be a real impediment. I know some systems will weed out people who do not have a master's degree, but there are organizations that will count years of experience in lieu of a master's degree. So maybe if the job required 15 years of experience or 12 years of experience plus a master's, they will count 2 to 3 additional years of experience in lieu of that degree. So it depends a little bit on the employer. But once you have 15 years of experience, the idea of going back to school, I'm sure for what it probably feels like checking the box, is frustrating. So if you really are having trouble getting your foot in the door, I'd recommend trying to do some informational interviews with people working in your field and find out how important it is to see if it is something you should consider going back to school for. Or if there are ways that you can overcome that by really focusing on your hands-on relevant experience, because as I said, that's typically what's at the end of the day more important to an employer. So a question on, does DevX still offer help editing CVs? Yes, definitely we have a CV writing team who, if you do want additional support with rewriting your CV based on your career goals, the employers that you're trying to work with, we will pair you with one of our CV writers for a very one-on-one, hands-on process of walking through what your challenges are and helping you to better communicate that. I believe as part of participating in this webinar, we will be getting an offer for a discount on that service. The price ranges depending on your total years of experience, but as a career account member, you also get discounted pricing on that. So we will be sending out more information, and so if you are interested in that, feel free to reach out to us, and somebody on our team can definitely talk to you more about that service. In addition to CVs, we can also help you with different formats that might be required by different employers or donors, cover letter writing, also helping you update your DevX and LinkedIn profiles, because I mentioned a lot of recruiters are doing proactive sourcing. So sometimes they don't ever even post a job. They, particularly if it's for consulting assignments, they may just go out and see who they find, searching through the database, and they find some people that are interested. They may avoid posting a job and sifting through a lot of applicants altogether. So it's really important to keep your online profiles up to date, an updated CV. Our search algorithm will rank you higher if you have a more recent CV, and recruiters are more likely to look at you, open your profile if it has a more recent date, more recent CV attached. So I encourage you, even if you aren't actively job seeking, to try to update that at least once a year. Okay. And then here I'm going to have one more question on what is the position of referees, including referrals on your CV. That's another good question. A lot of times people put on their references available upon request. It's not going to hurt you to say that. I don't think it's necessary, as I think most employers assume that you will be able to provide references. So again, it's just focusing on relevant information and keeping it really tight. I would consider that extraneous information you don't need to include. Same with including your references on the CV. Typically at that point, they're not interested in CV, in references. They're more interested in your experience, and that comes further in the process. I would say, though, that if you have a reference you think would be particularly strong for that employer, maybe it's somebody who's very close to the hiring manager or who works for the organization, sometimes it can be strategic to include them in there to show that you know that person. Sometimes when you do that, the recruiter will go and do kind of what they might call a backdoor reference and go ahead and contact that person and get a sense of who you are before even interviewing you. So if you do include references in your CV, make sure you've already given them a heads up because they could be contacted. But typically references come later in the process, so it's not really information you need to be including at that point. All right. Well, I'm afraid we have come to the end of our scheduled time for today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you learned some things and have some good takeaways from the conversation that are helpful in thinking about your CV. Please stay tuned for our remaining 2 webinars, part of this Job Search Bootcamp, Wednesday, December 13th, on how to get job search ready. We'll be talking about job search strategies, both on DevX and elsewhere, talking through a little bit more about your online profiles and how to be really strategic in your job search. On Wednesday, January 17th, we'll talk about cover letters, those do's and don'ts. As I mentioned, sometimes they are the afterthought, even for recruiters, but for some they are really important. So we'll talk about that and what to expect and what to focus on in doing your cover letters. If you have any further questions we weren't able to answer today, you can always reach out to us on Twitter. You can reach out to me directly on our @DevXCareers Twitter handle. And we'll be tweeting out some other resources on CVs we want to make sure you have access to. As a Career Account member, I encourage you to also check out our Career Center page on the DevX website, which has all kinds of information around CVs and your job search. I will post that right here in the Q&A box, the link to it, just in case you don't have it. But it's a great resource for all things around your job search if you're actively in that mode. But again, thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you in our next online event.